Will Wade makes his return to Neville Arena, and we reminisce on the last 15 years at Neville Arena. Welcome into this edition of the Barn Hoops podcast on the Barn Auburn YouTube channel and podcast platform as we get the news of Auburn's ACC-SEC Challenge opponent. It will be NC State and Will Wade heading to Neville Arena on December 3rd. We'll dive into that matchup and a little bit more of the ACC-SEC Challenge later in the show. But first, we're going to start off reminiscing on the incredible moments that we have witnessed inside Neville Arena, formerly Auburn Arena, prior to 2022, and just some of the best moments, some of the best games that occurred in that building since Coach Pearl has gotten to the program, and even a little bit before that, and how that building has created so many magical and incredible moments. But before that, we must tell you that this show is brought to you by mybookie.ag. Go to mybookie.ag and use the coupon code BARN, that's BARN, to receive a 50% deposit bonus up to $1,000. So use the coupon code BARN, B-A-R-N, for a 50% deposit bonus up to $1,000. Use that this weekend for your U.S. Open needs up at Oakmont. That got started yesterday in Pennsylvania. So a lot of great action coming at Oakmont Country Club, as well as with the NBA Finals and Stanley Cup Finals. But as I was saying, we are getting ready to talk about the last 15 years of Neville Arena. This 24-25 campaign wrapped up the 15th season of the building, and what was formerly Auburn Arena became Neville Arena in 2022, and the conclusion of that season has provided a lot of amazing moments, a lot of amazing games, and let's dive right into it. Auburn has a 175-64 record at home since the 2010-11 season, and I think even an even better stat here is that Auburn has not lost more than 2 games inside Neville Arena in the last 8 seasons, other than the 2020-21 season when there was limited attendance. Auburn was on that postseason ban, and really it just was not a normal year for Auburn. That was the year Sharif Cooper and JT Thor were one and done. Cooper didn't play more than 10 games, maybe a dozen games, but point being, outside of the abnormal season where the jungle wasn't in full force, Auburn has not lost more than 2 games inside Neville Arena, and that's pretty amazing. So let's dive right into this list that I've put together of some of the best moments, and I want you to be interactive and talk about some of the games I might have missed or some of your favorite moments and add on to what we have here. I'm actually going to start with honorable mentions because I'm going to go through a bunch of wins, but there's a couple of games that Auburn lost that were pretty amazing games, and another game from prior to Coach Pearl's time. It wasn't the most exciting game, but it was an electric atmosphere, starting off with the most recent game that took place in Neville Arena, Auburn and Alabama, to wrap up the 2025 season, when Janai Broome had a career day, scoring 34 points, including 2 huge three-pointers in overtime, before ultimately falling in overtime to Alabama on a Mark Sears buzzer beater. It was still probably the game of the year in college basketball, and it's just unfortunate Auburn didn't come on top, as it was such an incredible game. Going back to 2019, Auburn and Kentucky faced off, and it was the first of 3 meetings. Auburn lost the first 2 meetings, this one at home, and then got dominated on the road at Rupp Arena, but then ultimately avenged those 2 losses with the Elite 8 win to head to its first Final Four. But this game at home was a big come from behind game for Auburn. It overcame a 17-point second-half deficit. That'll be a trend that we see in this list of games. Auburn tends to come back from some deficits in a lot of these games, but Jared Harper, if you remember that three-pointer he hit with 30 seconds left, it was a heck of a pop in that arena. Even if you were watching on television, what an incredible game that was. Bryce Brown scored 28 points in that game as well. And then going all the way back to 2013, this is pre-Bruce Pearl, Auburn beat Alabama 49-37. That's not in itself an impressive feat or game or anything like that. These were 2 very bad basketball teams that were facing off. But it was still a fun atmosphere. Cam Newton, he was back for his spring semester to wrap up his college degree. He was in the middle of the student section leading cheers and being a part of the atmosphere. And that's one of my more earlier memories of Auburn basketball, and especially this building kind of starting to see the magic build, seeing what it could be when that team became eventually a good basketball program and had all the hype behind them. So getting into this list, and I'm going to try not to spend too much time on each individual one, but some of these obviously have a deeper backstory or might lead into something that we'll get into it, though. But the first game that stands out to me the most, and we're going in chronological order here, is the UAB game in 2015. Auburn won 75-74. This was not Bruce Pearl's or Auburn's best team. And there's another game from this season that we'll talk about why it's on it. But this was a non-conference game where Auburn brought UAB down to Auburn Arena at that time, now Neville Arena, and really put together a great game plan against a NCAA tournament team the previous year that brought back all of its starters. This was a UAB team that was very good, and Auburn's home court advantage. It was the night before the Georgia football game at Jordan-Hare Stadium. So, it was a packed house, and TJ Lang had a game-winning three with 15 seconds left. Horace Spencer, that's a big name from the Final Four team. It was his freshman campaign. He came out with a game-winning block on UAB's final shot. Just an electric moment, and probably one of the first in the arena's history. Again, you go back to that 2013 game against Alabama, but this game against UAB, where you've got the football crowd in the building, and it's getting ready for a football game the next day. And that mattered at that point. Then obviously that's not much of a concern anymore. You're trying to find any way to get into the building nowadays with 72 consecutive sellouts. But back then it was much easier to get inside Neville Arena. And that was one of those games where Auburn trailed and came from behind and beat UAB in exciting fashion. Later on that season, this was the moment. This was the moment that really, I think, spurred Auburn under Coach Bruce Pearl and this era. It was the win over number 13 Kentucky, 75-70. It snapped an 18-game losing streak against the Wildcats, and obviously that's the game where Auburn, the student section and the fans stormed the floor. It's the only time that that's happened in the modern era. Obviously, going way back, things were a little bit different, but that's the only time Auburn has stormed the floor. It was the first win against Kentucky in quite some time, and it was to be celebrated. Kareem Canty had 26 points, including 5 threes. There was that one three-pointer with about 5 minutes to go in the game that was banked off the backboard over one of the tall centers for Kentucky. I'm not sure who it was, but it was a sizable Kentucky team. It was your typical John Calipari Kentucky team with all the 5 stars, but Auburn ultimately won that game behind Canty and Simeon Bowers' efforts that night. And then going on to next season, another non-conference game against Mercer. Again, early on, some of these bigger names don't come along because this is some of the most exciting wins. Against Mercer, Auburn wins 76-74 on a TJ Dunnins buzzer-beating three-pointer. TJ Dunnins was not a three-point shooter leading up to that. I think he had made maybe 5 threes counting that day in that season. And it was just there was a few seconds left. Auburn had little to no shot, but got it inbounds to Dunnins. He turns around and buries the three from the corner right in front of the Auburn bench. And it was just, that's, again, another incredible moment that really jumpstart this arena's history. This was also during winter break, so not all the students were in town, but the holiday bleachers were in effect, so you had plenty of fans downstairs, and it was very exciting. This was also Austin Wiley's first game as an Auburn Tiger. He graduated high school and enrolled early so that he could play in that second half of the season. Wiley in that game had 9 points, 3 rebounds, and 2 blocks. Nothing too impressive, but that was a 17-year-old Austin Wiley. And again, a guy that was on the Final Four team and really made an impact in his career at Auburn. Moving on later in the season, Auburn defeated Alabama in 2017, 84-64. And this was the Austin Wiley coming out party. He had 19 points and 9 rebounds in this game. And it was just an electric atmosphere throughout. Auburn, this was a big year. I think Auburn swept Alabama in this season as well. And Patrick Kahn made a three-pointer at the buzzer to ultimately give Auburn the 20-point victory. Obviously, Kahn being a walk-on, that was an exciting moment. And just the pop of that arena matches some of the moments that we're going to talk about later on here when Auburn is facing, a top 10 team as a top 10 team. And when the environment is as good as it will ever get. Moving on to the next season, it was Valentine's Day, 2018 against Kentucky. This was the season that Auburn won the SEC regular season championship. We'll get into that next. But this Kentucky game, it was a midweek late at night on Valentine's Day, but the Jungle still showed out. One of the more exciting games that Auburn played prior to the Final Four run in 2019. Anthony McLemore had 13 points at 11 rebounds. Just a great game from him. Another guy that was on that Final Four team that, he doesn't get the shine of a Jared Harper, Bryce Brown, or Chuma Okeke, but you could see it early on. Some of those moments that build to that team becoming what it was, and just in an intense environment against a great Kentucky team. McLemore had an electrifying alley-oop in that game that really kind of sealed the deal against the Wildcats late in that game. So moving on to the regular season finale against South Carolina, this game clinched Auburn's first SEC regular season title since 1999. And going into that game, everyone knew what was on the line. So that built a tense environment for that game where Bryce Brown scored 29 points on 8 3-pointers and really just an incredible game where, late in the game, Auburn had a premature confetti moment where the confetti fell early, a few minutes early. Fortunately, did not lose that game and have a tough moment there. But this was also 2 weeks following Anthony McLemore's ankle injury, which was at South Carolina. Anthony McLemore was lost for that 2018 season when he broke his ankle at South Carolina. So a lot of emotion and a lot of motivation in that game to clinch that SEC title and win the game for Anthony. And again, just be able to celebrate in front of your fans in a season finale. Moving on to the 2018-19 season, we moved to the first game of the SEC season against Georgia. Auburn won this game 93-78. But again, this is just getting the SEC play started. No one had any thoughts of what was to come for this team later in March and April. But this game, it had an incredible sequence that this is my freshman year. And this is the year that obviously, again, like I said, Auburn makes the Final Four for the first time. But this is my first SEC game that I'm front and center in the Jungle and watching the Tigers play. And when Malik Dunbar catches that alley-oop with about 4 minutes to play, just the roof comes off the building. And that was an incredible moment in itself. But Tom Crean calls timeout for Georgia, trying to rally the troops as it's still in reach with 4 minutes to go, and this crowd's going crazy. So you're trying to calm the crowd down. It doesn't calm down. And the very next possession, Chuma Okeke posterizes Nick Claxton, who goes on to have an NBA career, the one that he's having right now. So that sequence was just an incredible one where you saw the talent start to take over for an Auburn team for the first time and really deliver a moment that was so electric. Rod Bramblett, the late, great Rod Bramblett, had an incredible call on that Malik Dunbar alley-oop. Night. It was with 4 minutes left, and I can only imagine that the crowd's reaction kind of pushed him to make that call, and with so much time left in the game, and Georgia's still in reach, and Auburn wound up winning by 15 points anyway. Later on that season, the last game of the regular season, the SEC finale, was against number 5 Tennessee, and Auburn won that game 84-80. This was coming off 3 straight wins against Georgia on Chuma Okeke's buzzer-beating win, a home game against Mississippi State, and then the win at Alabama, the first win in Tuscaloosa in a few years, and to sweep the Crimson Tide. This was also following that devastating defeat at Rupp Arena. I think Auburn lost by 28 points at Kentucky that year. So Auburn's back to riding high on riding some great momentum. And you got a number 5 team in the country coming to town, and Auburn handled it to perfection. This was also spring break. This was the first day of spring break for the students, but those that hung back were absolutely into the game and were involved and created a hostile environment for a top 5 Volunteers team. And this was the game where you realized what Jared Harper, Bryce Brown, and Chuma Okeke were made of. Okeke dropped 22 points. Harper and Brown had 16 apiece. And this was the game where you saw what it meant for Bryce Brown, him jumping on the scorer's table after the game to play in front of Neville Arena, in front of the Auburn family. And it was just an incredible moment. And again, really sparked that March 2019 run to the SEC Tournament Championship the very next week against that same Tennessee team, and then to the Final Four in Minneapolis, taking down Kansas, North Carolina, and Kentucky on that run. Also, not to mention the moment of the game, to me at least, there are several moments you can point to, but I thought with about a minute to go. Auburn's up 3 with the ball. Jared Harper drives down the right side of the lane, gets a shot blocked, but it goes straight to Samir Dowdy on the left wing. He takes a 3, makes it. I mean, it was really a moment of destiny. And, going back and looking at what transpired later that month, it makes perfect sense that that's how that game would really be sealed and for Auburn to win that game going into the postseason. Moving on to the 2019 to 2020 season, this is the year where Isaac Okoro has joined the roster. And obviously, this is you had a first-round pick in Chuma Okeke, but there wasn't as much hype around Okeke going into that draft. He obviously tore his ACL against North Carolina and then was still drafted by the Orlando Magic at the number 16 selection. But Isaac Okoro coming in, you knew what you were getting in him, and that was probably a one-and-done player. So this was a wild season, the 2019 to 20 season. And not everything happened at home, but you start off early. You go down to Mobile to play South Alabama. Okoro hits a game-winning layup with several seconds left in the game. And then leading into this game, number 18 LSU, where Auburn won in overtime. That was the third overtime game in 4 games. And the very next game that we'll talk about in a moment was another overtime game. But this game against LSU it took some heroics from Javon McCormick, the senior point guard who many talked about being undersized and not good enough to play in the SEC. Well, in the final minute of this game where Auburn trailed again in the second half, and it had several games in a row here, he makes 3 consecutive threes in 60 seconds to tie the game, send it to overtime. And as you can imagine, this place is buzzing. Neville Arena is unlike it's ever been because this is a run that was not expected at all. This is a good LSU team. We're going to talk about Will Wade later. This is a Will Wade coach team, a team that won the SEC regular season title before the season was ultimately cut short. And the overtime started with LSU making a bucket, but then it was immediate 9-0 run for Auburn with 3-pointers from Samir Dowdy and Devin Cambridge. I think Cambridge made 7 3-pointers in this game, so he scored 21 points on strictly 3-pointers. And, of course, we know what Samir Dowdy does. But also, the moment of this game was later in overtime. And here's the thing. I guess there's 2 moments of overtime, quite frankly. This was the wildest game, I think. If I were ranking these, this is number 1. Because, again, you go from McCormick's 3 straight threes in the final minute of regulation to tie the game. Auburn was down double digits in the second half. And then you start overtime on a 9-2 run on threes from Dowdy and Cambridge, who's made 7 of them. He scored 20 points in his freshman campaign. And then Isaac Okoro absolutely has the place come unglued with a driving baseline dunk that it was probably at that point I don't know. We go back to that Georgia game the year prior with Malik Dunbar's alley-oop and Chuma Okeke's poster, but this dunk, you could feel it in the building. And that put Auburn up quite a bit, but then LSU claws right back and takes the lead with less than 10 seconds to go, I think. And now you're Auburn, you call timeout, and you got to draw something up. And it's drawn up for Javon McCormick, the guy who got you to that point with his final minute of regulation. You give him the ball. Austin Wiley sets a heck of a screen on Trendon Watford, and it results in a game-winning floater for Javon McCormick with a 1/10 of a second left. So Auburn won that game 91-90 in overtime. It was his 3rd straight overtime victory in the SEC. And that moves on to the following Wednesday against Alabama, where the Tigers beat the Crimson Tide 95-91 in overtime. And the reason this game was so wild was Auburn started this game up 16-0. Auburn came out firing. Anthony McLemore, I think, made 3 threes to start the game. And then Alabama was able to claw its way back with at the time, SEC record 22 3-pointers made. But it was the 4th overtime game in 5 contests for the Tigers, and Auburn continued to win them. And this Auburn team, again, going into overtime, just settled down because Alabama, it didn't look like it was in the game until very late. Tied the game in the final minute of regulation, but Auburn settled in for overtime and won that game 95-91. Then moving on to another back and forth game in this same season. This LSU, Alabama, and this next game, Tennessee, that we're talking about, were 3 straight home games. There were a couple road games mixed in there as well. But these are 3 straight home games where you got some incredible basketball inside Neville Arena. That's not to mention the 2 overtime road games at Arkansas and Ole Miss that preceded the LSU game. So this Auburn and Tennessee game where the Tigers won 73-66, Auburn overcame a 17-point second half deficit with an 18-0 run. It went down by 17 and then just came back and won without allowing another point. That's kind of a wild run for Auburn. And again, this was a game where CBS was in the building, so there's a bigger feel at that time when you're on a broadcast television with CBS and Jalen Williams. He had that wild off the backboard alley-oop to himself to start the second half that's been played on highlights forever, especially when he graduated a couple of years ago. But again, this run, this 18-0 run, was one of those moments in that building where, it felt like at some point it was going to stop, it was going to slow down, but it was just an avalanche. And the building was so loud and you couldn't imagine. And Devin Cambridge, Samir Dowdy hitting big threes. Anthony McLemore knocked one down as well. Just an incredible run. And that wraps up that 2020 season for me. I didn't even mention the Kentucky game. It was the first college game day that Auburn had hosted. Obviously, now it's hosted in 5 straight seasons, with the COVID year being the exception, with it not going on location. So that shows you how wild this 19-20 campaign was, and unfortunately was cut short due to the COVID-19 pandemic. We're going to skip over the 2021 or the 2020 to 2021 season. Auburn was 8-5 at home that year. Not a ton of action. The Kentucky game that year was not the most exciting one, but again, Sharif Cooper provided some magical moments in Neville Arena. I shouldn't go without mentioning that, as he played a great role for that team. But some of those games were just not the most exciting. And again, that was the worst season at home for Auburn in the past decade or so. So moving on to the 2021 to 22 season, when Jabari Smith, Walker Kessler joined the Tigers, we moved to that Kentucky game in the middle of January. It is absolutely cold, but the students camped out for the first time, quite frankly, leading into that game. Auburn was number 2, probably should have been number 1 already. So that was kind of the hype around that game, was Auburn got robbed of that number 1 ranking. And if the Tigers can take down a number 12 Kentucky, they're going to be number 1 on Monday when the rankings are released. And that's exactly what happened. Auburn defeated Kentucky 80-71 in what was somewhat of a back and forth game early on, for Auburn ultimately took control in the middle parts of that second half. And Kentucky couldn't really climb back with National Player of the Year Oscar Tshiebwe. But in this game, this was, again, a moment where I'm sure anyone who was at this game thinks back to all the time. The Devin Cambridge dunk in the second half that gave Auburn the lead pretty much for good. And I think it was for good. Just the immediate timeout by Kentucky, and that place came unglued. It was an incredible atmosphere with all the students that had camped out from that night. That was my senior year. I was at this game as the Jungle president, and just an incredible night at Neville Arena. Not to be outdone a couple of weeks later when Auburn beat Alabama 100-81 for a sweep of the Crimson Tide, first one in several years. And this extended that team's winning streak to 18 games. It ended at 19. Auburn defeated Georgia at Georgia the very next week and then fell against Arkansas. But when you're on a winning streak like this, it really gives confidence to the crowd, and every shot felt absolutely massive, especially against your biggest rival in Alabama. And that even comes down towards the end of the game. Katie Johnson hits a big 3 with 4 minutes left. Alabama calls timeout, and everyone's kind of called the dogs off, but you still got to play basketball with 4 minutes to play. And what that results in is walk-on Carter Sabera's and 1 to score 100. And, I say that Devin Cambridge moment was as loud as I've heard Neville Arena. Carter Sabera might have matched that with that layup and foul in the closing stages of that game to put up a 100-piece on the Crimson Tide in 2022. So an incredible year that resulted in an SEC championship, and I think a number 2 seed in the NCAA tournament with Jabari Smith and Walker Kessler, and an SEC championship, obviously. Moving on a couple of years, we move to the 2023 to 24 season, where Auburn hosted number 16 Alabama, and Jalen Williams and Janai Broome had just an incredible game, combined for 50 points between the senior and the junior, as those two guys, again, this isn't Johni Broome's coming out party, but this was the moment you realize he was made for the big time. And obviously, we saw what the National Player of the Year did this past season to lead Auburn to a Final Four. But Jalen Williams in that game, the end of the first half, that sequence, the final two possessions were absolutely electric, with Jalen Williams with a breakaway windmill dunk that forced a timeout by Alabama for its final possession of the half, to KD Johnson locking up Mark Sears. And he didn't even get a shot off to end that first half. That really set the tone where, again, this is a ranked good Alabama team, and you go into halftime feeling confident as ever after that dunk by Williams and that defense by KD Johnson. So again, just an incredible moment there, and what resulted in a great game. It didn't quite match the 2022 version where Auburn got to 100 points, but 99-81, you'll take that every time. And then the final game on this list comes from this past season. This is the 15th game I had on the list for the 15 years that Neville Arena has opened its doors. Against number 6, Tennessee. I believe this is the first top 10 matchup. I believe this is the first time Auburn was ranked in the top 10 as well as its opponent. It wasn't the highest ranked opponent as Tennessee was number 5 in 2019, but at that time, Auburn wasn't ranked. So this game, again, had a lot of hype going into it. You know, always Coach Pearl against Tennessee. That's always a big moment. It's the outlive game for Coach Pearl's fight against cancer. And again, this is another camp out game where it was really cold, but students were lined up early for this game. It was a 7:30 tip. College game day was there. And quite frankly, this game wasn't the best game in the world to watch, but it was still intense. It was a rock fight. And Auburn ended up winning 53-51 on that Miles Kelly game, winning 3 from the corner in front of the Auburn bench. And this was also Johni Broome's first action since his injury at South Carolina. And I think this is the main reason it's on the game, other than Kelly's 3-pointer at the end. But Broome played a factor in that as well. Broome hadn't played, and I don't think there was a ton, and Auburn didn't play a midweek game as well. It's obviously every SEC team gets that one open date, and Auburn's was leading into the Tennessee game. Broome comes back, and he's the best player on the floor by far. Chaz Lanier was not good in that game, and Zakai Ziegler did his thing on defense, but he was not as effective on offense as Johni Broome was, with 16 points, 12 rebounds, and 4 blocks on pretty much one leg. And then he comes up, he misses what was to be a potential game-tying layup, gets his own rebound, kicks it out to Miles Kelly, who makes the game-winning 3. And again, this crowd was incredible. The Auburn players go into the student section to celebrate, all the way into the student section concession area. Dylan Cardwell leading the charge, as you can imagine. But just that was an incredible game that really summed up the season for Auburn basketball in 24-25. Obviously, you know, I mentioned the Alabama game that Auburn ultimately lost. That was an electric game. The Auburn-Florida game wasn't as great of a game. Auburn made its run, but Florida ultimately took control of that game. So really, that Tennessee game was the one that stands out, I think, for fans when you look at the Neville Arena season for this past year. So that's my list of my top 15 games, not in order, in chronological order, games that have been played inside Neville Arena. But there's more to come, and that includes an ACC opponent this year, with NC State and Will Wade returning to the jungle. The SEC and the ACC and ESPN announced the matchups for the SEC-ACC Challenge this upcoming basketball season for the men and the women. The women for Auburn are going to be heading up to Syracuse for that challenge. But for the men, it'll be NC State coming down to Neville Arena. Auburn's played NC State a few times over the past decade, but this will be the first time with Will Wade, obviously, as he's in his first year as head coach of the Wolfpack. He's obviously had to make a big, really additions to the transfer portal, and he's done that. Added Darion Williams from Texas Tech, who was a critical part of the Elite Eight run for the Red Raiders. Trey Holloman, who Auburn saw last year in the Elite Eight. And then it was Van Allen Lubin from UNC, who Auburn saw back in Maui last year for the Tar Heels. So a lot of top-tier talent. There are some McNeese State transfers that have joined the roster. Will Wade picked up a center from Florida State. This is going to be a stacked roster. This is going to be a good team that comes to Neville Arena for NC State. I know all the Auburn fans wanted to see Duke in Neville Arena, and I did too. That would have been awesome to see the Boozer twins come down and that environment, as you know, we were just talking about the past 15 years, how awesome it is against those good teams. This game is going to provide a great environment as well. And this will be sandwiched between the Players Era Festival as well as that game out in Tucson against Arizona. So that week, there's really 3 weeks, will be really stacked for this Auburn basketball team. You're going to learn a lot about the Tigers in those 3 weeks as well. I expect to see some news about the Players Era Festival coming out in the next couple of weeks as they figure out the formatting of that tournament and some of the dates. Other matchups in this SEC-ACC challenge include, as I mentioned, Duke will be hosting Florida, the defending national champion, going to another Final Four team, which, you know, that could have been the national championship. That never happened. And then North Carolina is going to Kentucky, 2 Blue Bloods duking it out. Louisville goes to Arkansas, so John Calipari gets to face his old rival from when he was at Kentucky against Pat Kelsey and what I think is a really good Louisville squad. I would have loved to see Louisville come down to Auburn, but I totally see why the Cardinals are headed to the Razorbacks for that matchup. And then finally, another good matchup that I think will be a lot of fun to watch. Clemson goes to Alabama. This is the second time in 3 years these two teams faced off against each other, I think in the Elite Eight when Alabama made the Final Four. So these are really good matchups across the board. I think ESPN and these conferences did a good job at matching these teams up. Again, I want to see Duke come down to Auburn. I think that would be awesome. At some point, I want to see Virginia come down to Auburn. But I think for this season, this is what is going to be great. I think this also leads to the possibility of Auburn going to UNC in 2026 as UNC's at home. So that means, because these are on 2-year rotations, so you could play at home 2 years in a row or on the road 2 years in a row, but you're never going to play that. You're never going to do it 3 years in a row. So next year, Auburn will be on the road for this game. And I love the thoughts of going to UNC and playing in the Dean Dome for that game. And Louisville will also be at home. So that's another possibility to go face Pat Kelsey and the Cardinals in 2026. But again, we're still obviously getting into the offseason. So I'm going to do a few more podcasts like these, maybe reminiscing on former Auburn teams and Auburn players, Auburn games, and whatever it might be. So we'll see what's to come as we move along this offseason, and hope you enjoy your Father's Day weekend if you are a father or you're celebrating with your father. And stay tuned to the Barn Auburn Podcast Network and YouTube channel as more and more offseason content is released. Village Vice, Top Button Podcast with Charlie 5, and even the Barn Baseball Show is wrapping up the season after a super regional run for the Tigers baseball program. So make sure you subscribe, hit the like button, comment what games I missed from the last 15 years of Auburn basketball inside Neville Arena that were most exciting to you, and kind of just reminisce on some of your favorite moments inside Neville Arena as well. So with that being said, thank you for tuning in to today's edition of the Barn Hoops podcast. We looked over the last 15 years, did a little preview of Will Wade's return to Neville Arena, and obviously we will continue moving along with this offseason. I hope to see you next time on the Barn Hoops podcast.